The gun barrels still ticked as they cooled. 450 calibers and one 20mm Hispano, all of them clustered in that narrow nosepod between the twin booms, radiating heat into the wet New Guinea air like a cook stove left on overnight. Cordite hung in a thin blue film around the nose wheel. The crew chief, and every crew chief on a P-38 line, learned to read an airplane the way a vet reads a dog. Walked the airframe looking for holes, for stress wrinkles in the skin, for hydraulic weeping along the boom seams. What he found instead stopped him at the nose. He cracked the ammo bay panels, every belt dry. The 450 caliber trays held nothing but brass-stained feed pawls and the sour metallic smell of spent primer. The Hispano drum sat empty too. Roughly 2,000 rounds of mixed ammunition, ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, had left this airplane since breakfast, none of which was extraordinary on its own. Plenty of pilots in the 5th Air Force hosed off their ammunition on strafing runs, chewing up barges and revetments across the northern coast, coming home with empty trays and nothing to show but cratered coral. But this pilot hadn't been strafing. He'd been at altitude, and the crew chief already knew, because the pilot had told him on the walk-in, with the kind of flat, dehydrated calm that follows adrenaline burn-off, that 7 Japanese aircraft had gone down under those guns in a single continuous engagement. 7. Not across a week of patrols, not spread over 3 sorties. 7 enemy fighters and attack planes, confirmed or claimed in one mission, burned through so fast that the wingman flying his flank never cleared a stoppage in his own guns quickly enough to matter. If that story sounds like the kind of thing worth preserving, hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment with the Pacific unit or theater your family served in. These crews kept lousy diaries, and sometimes a comment section fills in what the archives lost. Now, 7 aerial victories in a single sortie from a single airframe, using nothing but nose-mounted guns with a fixed convergence point. The arithmetic works against it at every level. A P-38 Lightning carried enough 50 caliber ammunition for roughly 14 seconds of continuous fire across all 4 guns. 14 seconds. The Hispano cannon added maybe 6 seconds more. Call it 20 seconds of total trigger time to produce 7 kills, which means either this pilot fired in bursts so short and so precise that each one connected with a vital structure, engine, cockpit, wing root, or he somehow found 7 enemy aircraft obliging enough to fly through the same patch of sky at the same convergence range, one after another, while he held steady and pressed the button. Neither explanation is simple. Both are partially true. The full answer involves something stranger than marksmanship alone. It involves what the Japanese pilots did wrong, and what they kept doing wrong, sortie after sortie, long after they should have adapted. Their tactical failures turned a gifted American shooter into something closer to a machine. And the documentary record from Japanese aviators who survived similar engagements over New Guinea reads less like tactical analysis than like bewilderment. Officers at Rabaul, writing after-action summaries, used language that translates roughly to the effect that the twin fuselage fighters attacked from above with a speed that left no time for evasion and struck with a concentration of fire unlike anything delivered by single-engine opponents. That concentration: 4 heavy machine guns and a cannon converging on a single point roughly 300 yards ahead of the nose, no wing-mounted scatter, no convergence geometry to calculate, turned the P-38 into something the Japanese had not trained against and could not replicate. Their own fighters carried 2 rifle-caliber guns in the cowling and 2 20mm cannons in the wings. Spread pattern. The Lightning's armament hit like a fist, 1 point in space, everything arriving together. A half-second burst at convergence range put 60 rounds of 50 caliber and a dozen explosive 20mm shells into an area the size of a card table. Against unarmored Japanese airframes built to save weight at every structural joint, a half-second burst didn't damage the airplane. It removed pieces of it. To understand how one pilot exploited that weapon system 7 times in a single flight, and why his opponents kept presenting themselves for the next burst instead of breaking off, we have to go back to what the 5th Air Force learned about Japanese fighter tactics over Wewak, Leh, and the Huon Peninsula in the months before this mission. Because the 7 kills didn't start in the cockpit. They started in a doctrine gap that Japanese Aviation Command refused to close, even as the evidence piled up in wreckage across the Owen Stanley Range. 1937, Burbank, California. Hall Hibbard and a 27-year-old engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson sat in front of an Army Air Corps specification sheet that asked for something no American manufacturer had ever built: a twin-engine interceptor capable of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, able to climb there in 6 minutes. The specification existed because coastal defense planners had nightmares about long-range bombers approaching from the Pacific, and single-engine fighters of that era couldn't get high enough fast enough to stop them. Lockheed's answer, designated the Model 22, broke every convention in pursuit aircraft design. 2 Allison V-1710 engines, each driving a turbo-supercharged propeller in counter-rotation to cancel torque. A central nacelle for the pilot, hanging between twin-tail booms like a gondola slung under a bridge, tricycle landing gear, which almost nobody used yet, and the detail that changed everything over New Guinea 6 years later. All the armament packed into that central nacelle, firing straight ahead, parallel to the aircraft's longitudinal axis. That last choice sounds obvious now. It solved a problem most pilots in 1937 didn't even know they had. Wing-mounted guns on a conventional single-engine fighter, a Zero, a Spitfire, an Oscar, pointed slightly inward. They had to. The bullets needed to cross at a predetermined distance ahead of the aircraft, the convergence point, where the streams from left and right wing intersected. Inside that range, the streams hadn't merged yet. Beyond it, they diverged. A pilot firing at 300 yards in an airplane harmonized for 250 put rounds on either side of his target with a gap between them wide enough to miss a fuselage entirely. Japanese pilots trained relentlessly in deflection shooting to compensate for this geometry, learning to feel convergence range the way a carpenter feels a level. Their evasion doctrine mirrored the same logic. Break hard into the attack. Force the enemy into a crossing shot at the wrong range, and his wing guns scatter harmlessly around you. It worked. Against wing-gunned opponents, it worked beautifully. The P-38 had no convergence problem. 4 M2, Browning 50 calibers sat stacked above a single AN-M2 cannon, all of them within a space roughly 2 feet wide, all firing dead ahead. The bullet streams didn't cross. They left the muzzles practically touching and stayed in a tight cluster out to 600 yards and beyond. A pilot didn't need to calculate harmonization. He pointed the nose at the target and pressed the trigger. At 200 yards, the pattern spread to maybe 18 inches. At 400, it opened to roughly a yard. A Japanese airframe presented a target 12 to 15 feet across in planform. The math turned grotesque, and the sensation of firing all 5 guns simultaneously. Accounts from Lightning pilots describe it less as recoil and more as a vibration that climbed through the yoke into the forearms and settled behind the sternum, a low-frequency hum that made the instrument panel blur for a half-second until the burst ended. The nose dipped slightly under the collective impulse of 5 weapons cycling. Spent brass and links cascaded into collection bins under the cockpit floor, rattling like gravel dumped into a metal bucket. The smell reached the pilot almost instantly. Burned powder, hot oil from the barrel jackets, a scorched copper note that stuck to oxygen masks and stayed there for hours after landing. Japanese Naval Air Force intelligence identified the P-38 as a distinct threat category by mid-1943. They gave it a reporting name. But among operational pilots in the 11th Air Fleet and the units rotating through Rabaul, it picked up a different label. Surviving Japanese accounts from the Solomons and New Guinea campaigns reference the Lightning as the fork-tailed devil, a phrase that has floated through American popular history for decades, sometimes disputed, sometimes embellished. What the USSBS interrogation transcripts confirm without ambiguity is that Japanese fighter pilots considered the P-38 a fundamentally different kind of opponent than the P-40 or the F-4U, not faster in every regime, not more maneuverable. It absolutely could not turn with an A-6M at low speed, and any Lightning pilot who tried died for the mistake. The difference they identified, repeatedly, centered on the closing speed in vertical attacks and the lethality of a single firing pass, one kill. That phrase appears in translated Japanese tactical assessments from Rabaul dated late 1943, warning pilots that the twin fuselage fighter did not need a prolonged engagement to destroy its target, which created a compounding disaster for the Imperial Navy's fighter doctrine. Their entire defensive system, the tight turning engagement, the mutual support weave, the reliance on agility over armor, assumed an opponent who would stay and fight in a turning contest. The P-38 refused. It dove, fired once, and climbed away on those twin supercharged Allisons before a Zero could reverse into the attack. The doctrine gap from Section 1 starts here, in a design decision made in Burbank before the war even began. General George Kenney told his staff in Brisbane that he wanted his fighter pilots to act like assassins, not duelers. The distinction turned the 5th Air Force into a kill factory, disguised as an air command, built around the deliberate cultivation of shooters who understood the dive and zoom geometry the lightning demanded. Thomas McGuire arrived at the 475th Fighter Group's forward strip at Dobodura in the spring of 1943, weighing maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, a wiry kid from Ridgewood, New Jersey, with a mechanical engineering degree and a reputation at flight school for being difficult to instruct. Not because he lacked ability, because he argued. He questioned convergence drills, fuel management tables, formation spacing. His instructors marked him as either brilliant or insubordinate, depending on which day you asked. Gerald Johnson, no relation to Kelly Johnson, the Lockheed designer, a coincidence that connects to nothing, had preceded McGuire into the theater by several months, already flying with the 49th Fighter Group out of the same muddy complex of coral-topped runways that the 5th Air Force carved into the Papua coast. Johnson stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, calm in the radio, the opposite of McGuire's coiled intensity. They flew P-38s. They killed with the same technique, the high-side diving pass, nose committed to the target for no more than 2 seconds, full deflection avoided entirely, firing only when the enemy filled the gunsight reticle from rim to rim. A half-second burst, break off, climb, reset, find the next one. The humidity at Dobodura sat above 90% most mornings, and pilots who strapped into the cockpit at dawn felt sweat pooling in the small of their backs before the Allisons even turned over, the greenhouse canopy trapping moisture and engine heat until takeoff airflow finally cut through the vents. By the time they reached combat altitude, 15 to 20,000 feet, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees and the sweat had gone cold against their flight suits. Kenney's system fed these men a steady supply of sorties, the way a boxing trainer feeds a prospect carefully matched opponents, callous partly. The replacement depot at Nadzab processed new pilots through a theater indoctrination program that lasted roughly 2 weeks. Local weather patterns, Japanese tactics briefings, gunnery practice against towed sleeve targets over the Huon Gulf. Exceptional shooters moved to the frontline squadrons faster. The rest stayed in the rear echelon flying patrol and transport escort until they improved or rotated home. The pipeline never stopped. American training infrastructure, primary, basic, advanced, operational, produced roughly 1,200 new fighter pilots every month by mid-1943 across all theaters. The 5th Air Force got a fraction of that number, but the fraction kept arriving, every month. Fresh pilots, fresh airframes crated and shipped from the Lockheed plant in Burbank, assembled at rear area depots, test flown, and delivered forward. The Japanese replacement system did not work this way. It had never needed to. Before Midway, before the Solomons, the Imperial Navy operated on the assumption that its pre-war trained aviators, men with 600 to 800 flight hours before their first combat assignment, represented a renewable asset. They did not. Midway killed a generation of dive bomber and torpedo crews in a single afternoon. The Solomons ground campaign, the relentless attrition over Guadalcanal and then Rabaul, burned through the fighter pilots at a rate that Japanese training bases could not match. By late 1943, replacement pilots arriving at forward airfields in New Guinea carried as few as 200 total flight hours. Some had never fired their guns at a moving target. The records on exact Japanese training hour figures conflict between post-war US SBS interrogations and surviving Japanese naval aviation documents, but both sources agree on the direction: steep decline, accelerating through 1944. McGuire and Johnson flew against these replacements, not exclusively. Veteran Japanese aces still operated in the theater: Nishizawa, Sugita, Okamura, men with kill counts that rivaled anything the American side produced. Encounters with these pilots went differently, but the bulk of the intercepts over Wewak, over Hollandia, over the Admiralties, pitted 5th Air Force veterans with 400 combat hours against Japanese pilots on their 5th or 6th mission. The skill differential showed up in the gun camera film. Japanese fighters braking the wrong direction, turning into the attack instead of splitting S away from the dive, presenting their planform, that 12 to 15-foot target area, broadside to a concentrated nose armament designed to exploit exactly that mistake. McGuire's kill tally climbed from 5 to 15 between August and December of 1943. Johnson's kept pace. Both men flew almost daily when weather and aircraft availability allowed, accumulating a pattern recognition library in their heads that no classroom could replicate. The way an Oscar's wing root buckled a quarter second before the fuel tank behind it caught fire, the way a Val's rear gunner stopped shooting when the pilot rolled inverted to dive away. Kenny tracked their scores personally. He wanted aces. Aces made headlines in the stateside papers, and headlines kept the Pacific Theater from becoming the forgotten war. 500. That number defined a Japanese naval aviator in 1942. 500 flight hours before first combat deployment, accumulated across a training pipeline, so selective that 90% of applicants washed out before they ever touched a stick. By January of 1944, the number had collapsed to under 100. Some replacement pilots shipping to forward bases in New Guinea logged as few as 70. The decline didn't happen gradually. It fell off a cliff after the Solomons campaign chewed through the veteran cadre faster than any pre-war planning model had anticipated, and the training command in Japan responded by doing the only thing it could: shortening the syllabus, cutting aerobatics, reducing live-fire exercises, and pushing half-trained men into cockpits that demanded reflexes they hadn't developed yet. Those 70-hour pilots climbed into Ki-43 Oscars and A-6M0s, carrying a set of evasion instincts built for a different war. Their abbreviated training still emphasized the hard turn: break into the attack, force an overshoot, reverse and pursue. The instructors who taught them this had learned it against wing-gunned opponents over China and Malaya, where a sharp enough break at the right moment opened the convergence gap and let bullets pass on either side of the airframe like water around a stone. Nobody updated the curriculum. The training manuals from Tsuchiura Naval Air Station, captured later in the war, still prescribed the break turn as the primary defensive response to a diving fighter attack through at least mid-1944. Against the P-38's nose-clustered armament, the break turn accomplished nothing useful. Worse than nothing, it presented the broad planform of the aircraft to the attacker at exactly the moment he pressed the trigger. A pilot braking left in an Oscar rolled his wings 45 degrees and pulled, exposing the entire top surface of the fuselage and both wing panels to a gunship that didn't care about convergence range because its guns never diverged. The bullet stream stayed tight, whether the Lightning fired at 150 yards or 400. The Japanese pilot executed his trained response perfectly and died for it. The Lockheed plant in Burbank, during peak production in 1944, turned out roughly 100 P-38s per month. Each airplane left the factory with its 450 caliber guns bore-sighted to a point 300 yards ahead of the nose, and the 20mm Hispano harmonized to the same spot. Armorers at forward depots in New Guinea sometimes adjusted this distance. McGuire reportedly preferred a slightly shorter convergence, around 250 yards, though the maintenance logs from the 475th that would confirm this don't survive. What does survive is gun camera footage showing the effect of that concentrated fire on lightly built Japanese airframes at close range: wings separating at the root, engines tearing free of their mounts, canopies disappearing in a single frame of film, cowlings buckling inward like tin. The damage patterns look less like gunfire and more like a structural failure test run at 10 times normal speed. The anaconda, the South American snake, not any weapons system, kills by constriction, tightening its coils each time the prey exhales until breathing becomes impossible. It doesn't crush, it waits. The prey's own breathing cycle does the work. Herpetologists at the Bronx Zoo measured constriction pressures in the 1930s and found that the snake adjusted force in real time, responding to the victim's heartbeat. This connects to nothing tactical, which brings us back to the training hour gap and what it meant in the air over Wewak. A 500-hour Japanese pilot, a Nishizawa, a Sakai, recognized the P-38's vertical attack profile and adapted. He didn't break into it. He split S underneath, trading altitude for separation, refusing the turn fight the Lightning wanted to avoid anyway, forcing the American to either follow him down into the weeds where the Allisons ran hot and the turbochargers lost their advantage, or break off and reset from altitude. That encounter ended in a draw more often than a kill. Both pilots went home. A 70-hour pilot didn't recognize anything. He saw a shape in his peripheral vision, hauled the stick back, and broke. The Lightning's nose tracked him through the turn. A half-second burst, 60 rounds of 50 caliber, a dozen 20mm shells, hit the airframe in a space smaller than a dining table. The Oscar or Zero, built without self-sealing fuel tanks or armor plate behind the pilot's seat, lacking any structural redundancy at the wing root, came apart. The American pilot watched pieces tumble away in his rearview mirror, already pulling up, already scanning for the next target, his ammunition counter clicking down by increments so small that 7 kills still left brass in the trays. Or didn't, depending on the pilot and the day, and how many bursts ran a half-second too long. The geometry multiplied the skill gap until the gap stopped being a gap and became a wall. Wewak sat on the northern coast of New Guinea like a bruise, a cluster of 4 airfields hacked out of kunai grass and coconut groves that the Japanese 4th Air Army used as its primary staging base for operations across the Bismarck Sea. On the morning Gerald Johnson rolled his P-38 onto the packed coral runway at Nadzab, 120 miles to the southeast, the weather report called for scattered cumulus building to thunderstorms by noon. Standard. Always standard. The equatorial sun turned the Huon Valley into a convection engine every afternoon, stacking clouds to 30,000 feet in columns so dense that radar couldn't see through them, and pilots who flew into them sometimes didn't fly out. The mission called for a fighter sweep ahead of a B-25 strike package. Get over Wewak first, catch Japanese interceptors on the climb, kill them before they reach the bombers. Clean and simple on the briefing board. Johnson's flight launched as a 4-ship. By the time they crossed the Finisterre Range, he had 2 wingmen. The 4th aircraft had turned back with a rough-running left engine, the turbochargers surging and recovering in cycles that meant either a wastegate failure or a cracked exhaust manifold. The pilot radioed the symptom, but not the diagnosis, and maintenance records from that day don't specify which. Over the coastal plain approaching Wewak, the 2nd wingman's radio died. Complete electrical failure in the communications bus, which on the P-38H sometimes cascaded into the gunsight power supply. He waggled his wings, pointed at his headset, and turned south for home. Johnson pressed on with 1 wingman. They found the Japanese at 14,000 feet, climbing in a loose gaggle out of Wewak's easternmost strip. Borum, probably, though the after-action report identifies the field only as the target area. Oscars. 8 to 10 of them strung out in a ragged climbing line abreast, still below Johnson's altitude by 3,000 feet, their noses cocked up at an angle that bled airspeed and left them hanging. Johnson rolled in. The first Oscar never saw him. The diving pass covered the altitude gap in seconds, and Johnson fired from 200 yards with the target's belly filling his windscreen. The burst lasted less than a second. The Oscar's left wing folded upward at the root, as if someone had broken a stick over a knee, and the fuselage tumbled sideways, trailing a rope of black smoke that unwound behind it all the way to the canopy. Johnson pulled through, converting his dive speed back into altitude, the G-forces pressing him into the seat hard enough that the dye from his harness straps left marks on his shoulders, visible at debrief. His wingman engaged a separate pair and got tangled in a turning fight, exactly the kind Kenny's doctrine forbade, but combat made inevitable when an Oscar cut across your nose at 100 yards and instinct overrode training. Johnson found himself alone, above 6 or 7 remaining Japanese fighters that had now scattered into individual evasive maneuvering, each pilot reacting to the attack independently because their formation discipline had dissolved the moment the first airplane went down. He killed 2 more in the next 90 seconds, both from above, both with short bursts that hit before the target completed its brake turn. The gun camera film from the second kill shows the Oscar's canopy separating from the fuselage in a bright flash, fuel vapor igniting in the cockpit, cooking off so fast that the airframe stayed intact for a full second after the fire started, a flying coffin still holding its turn radius while the pilot inside burned. Then, the remaining Oscars did something that contradicted every tactical manual the Japanese Fourth Air Army had published. They ran, split in different directions, dove for the deck, scattered like quail flushed from a hedgerow. Johnson chased one down to treetop level and put a burst into its engine from dead astern. It cartwheeled into the jungle canopy without burning. 4 confirmed, possibly a 5th. The after-action report notes a probable that Johnson himself refused to claim because he lost sight of the aircraft in ground clutter before seeing it impact. McGuire's mission happened separately, on a different day, over the same stretch of contested airspace. 5 kills in a single sortie. When crew chief Frank Spar climbed the ladder to help McGuire out of the cockpit afterward, he checked the ammunition counters and found zeros across the board. Every round of .50 caliber expended, every 20mm shell gone. McGuire had fired himself completely dry, something Johnson, with his shorter bursts and tighter trigger discipline, almost never did. The contrast irritated Kenny's intelligence staff, who preferred the cleaner kill-to-ammunition ratio. But McGuire had 5 airplanes down, 5 families in Japan that would receive a telegram written in administrative prose so restrained it barely acknowledged the violence that produced it. The wall held. On one side, American pilots with concentrated firepower and enough training hours to use it with surgical economy or wild expenditure, depending on temperament. On the other side, 70-hour replacement pilots executing a brake turn that killed them. How many airplanes does one man have to kill before the enemy stops calling it luck? 7. That appears to be the number. Not because 7 carries any mathematical significance in aerial combat, but because 7 kills across a handful of sorties, compressed into weeks, not months, forced Japanese Fourth Air Army intelligence officers to stop writing off P-38 losses as isolated incidents and start treating the fork-tailed fighter as a systemic problem requiring a systemic response. The USSBS interrogations, conducted after the war, pulled this admission out of surviving staff officers in fragments, reluctantly, the way a dentist extracts a tooth that the patient insists doesn't hurt. One officer from the Fourth Air Army's operations section at Rabaul described the nose armament of the P-38 as producing damage inconsistent with fighter-to-fighter combat. His phrasing, recorded through a translator, suggests he believed the wounds on recovered airframes came from ground-based anti-aircraft weapons rather than another airplane. He could not reconcile the destruction pattern with anything a single fighter should produce. The concentration of hits in a space smaller than a tatami mat, repeated across multiple wrecks pulled from the jungle, led his section to theorize briefly that the Americans had developed a new type of explosive bullet. They hadn't. They had developed a new type of geometry, and it sat in the nose of every lightning that flew over Wewak. The 7th kill, whether it belonged to Johnson's composite tally across sorties or McGuire's single-day expenditure of every round aboard, landed on an airframe that fell where Japanese ground crews could reach it. Most didn't. Most went into the sea or the jungle canopy, unrecoverable, their destruction witnessed only by gun camera film and the American pilot's combat report filed that evening over coffee and canned peaches at the squadron mess. But enough wreckage accumulated on accessible ground near Wewak and Hollandia for Japanese maintenance officers to document a pattern they found disturbing. Entry holes grouped so tightly that adjacent punctures overlapped, turning individual bullet impacts into ragged slots, structural members severed cleanly, not bent or deformed, the way scattered wing gun fire typically damaged them. A captured maintenance log from Hollandia, incomplete, water-damaged, translated at Allied Translator and Interpreter Section Headquarters in Brisbane, noted that 3 recovered Ki-43 airframes showed damage concentrated in an area of less than 1 square meter on each aircraft. The log's author attributed this to skilled marksmanship. Skilled marksmanship played a role. The nose gun arrangement played a larger one. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with P-38s provided their own testimony, though the surviving record is thinner than anyone studying this period would prefer. USSBS Interrogation Number 462, conducted in November 1945 with a former Army fighter pilot who had flown Oscars out of Wewak in early 1944, contains a passage where the pilot described the sound of the P-38's guns as a single noise rather than individual reports. He said it sounded like canvas tearing. That description, canvas tearing, appears in German accounts of American .50 caliber fire on the Western Front as well. 2 separate enemies on opposite sides of the planet, neither aware of the other's testimony, reached for the same fabric-ripping image to describe what concentrated automatic fire sounded like from the receiving end. The pilot from Interrogation 462 survived because he did not brake. He dove, straight down, full power, into the trees along the Sepik River floodplain, pulling out so low that his propeller tips clipped kunai grass, and he landed back at Wewak with vegetation jammed in his landing gear. His squadron lost 4 aircraft that day. He named none of the dead pilots during the interrogation. The transcript records a long pause at that point. The interviewer noted it with a parenthetical that simply reads, "Subject stopped speaking for approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds of silence in a transcript. A dead space where 4 names should sit. McGuire, on the day he fired himself dry, experienced something the after-action reports describe in clinical language, but the body registers differently. Sustained combat maneuvering at high G-load in tropical heat, repeated zoom climbs pulling 4 to 5 Gs on each recovery, the oxygen mask slipping on sweat-soaked skin, peripheral vision narrowing to a gray tunnel on every pull until the nose fell through the horizon and blood returned to the brain. 5 times he dove, 5 times he fired, 5 times something broke apart in front of him. His hands shook during debrief. Frank Spar mentioned this in a post-war interview, adding that McGuire asked for water before he asked for his kill count. The water came from a canvas Lister bag hanging in the shade of the revetment, lukewarm, tasting of purification tablets. McGuire drank 2 canteen cups before he said a word about the mission. Johnson's hands did not shake. Different men, same weapon, same geometry, same wall. On the Japanese side of that wall, an intelligence apparatus slowly assembled the evidence of what the nose-clustered armament meant for their trained defensive doctrine, and arrived at a conclusion they could not operationally act on. The brake turn killed their pilots, and they had nothing to replace it with. Every countermeasure the Japanese Fourth Air Army adopted against the P-38 made the P-38 more lethal. That statement sounds like hindsight bias. It isn't. The operational record from Wewak through Hollandia traces a sequence of tactical adjustments, each one rational, each one derived from real combat observation, that systematically funneled Japanese fighters into the exact engagement envelope the Lightning's designers had optimized for. The Japanese didn't fail to adapt. They adapted themselves to death. The first countermeasure arrived in early 1944, distributed as a mimeographed tactical bulletin from 4th Air Army Headquarters to squadron commanders across New Guinea. The bulletin prescribed head-on passes against the P-38. The reasoning held a certain logic. Approach from 12 o'clock level, fire at maximum range, brake underneath before the closure speed made collision inevitable. A head-on pass negated the Lightning's diving advantage and prevented the American from using his altitude. It also forced a mutual engagement where the Oscar's lighter weight and faster roll rate should, in theory, allow it to snap underneath and escape before the P-38's heavier airframe could follow. The bulletin circulated. Pilots read it. Some of them tried it. They flew nose first into 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon aimed directly at them, converged to a point, with no deflection required from the American pilot, because the target flew a zero-angle approach on a constant bearing. The P-38 didn't need to maneuver. It sat there and fired. The Oscar, presenting its smallest cross-section, engine cowling, propeller disc, a sliver of wing, still absorbed rounds in the engine block, the oil cooler, the propeller governor, the pilot. One round of 20mm Hispano through an air-cooled radial turned the engine into shrapnel. The head-on pass killed Japanese pilots at a rate the after-action reports from the 475th Fighter Group described with a word they rarely used for air-to-air engagements: easy. The second countermeasure came from the veterans, not headquarters. The split S, that diving half-roll the 500-hour pilot from Section 4 used to survive. By mid-1944, enough survivors had passed the technique along that replacement pilots began attempting it as a trained response rather than an instinctive one. The problem sat in the gap between knowing the maneuver and executing it under fire at 14,000 feet with a P-38 already in a firing pass. A proper split S required the pilot to roll inverted, pull through, and exit heading the opposite direction at a lower altitude. Done correctly, it worked. Done with 70 hours of training, at 300 knots, with adrenaline compressing every decision into a space thinner than a razor blade. The pilot pulled too hard, overstressed the airframe, and the Oscar's wings, built to flex rather than absorb, failed at the root. Or he pulled too little, hung inverted for a half-second too long, and the Lightning's nose tracked across his belly while he floated there, presenting the largest possible target silhouette. Gun camera footage from the 395th Fighter Squadron, spring 1944, shows an Oscar beginning a split S and stopping halfway through, inverted, nose dropping, speed building, while tracers walk across the underside of the fuselage from tail to engine in a line so straight it looks drawn with a ruler. The aircraft entered the jungle canopy, inverted at an estimated 350 knots. The timestamp on the camera film reads 11:47 a.m. Location: approximately 8 miles southeast of Wewak. The pilot's name does not appear in any surviving Japanese record, cross-referenced to that date and location. Sources conflict on whether the 4th Air Army even maintained reliable loss records by that point in the campaign. The third countermeasure, dispersal on contact, produced the grimmest irony: scatter, break formation, run in every direction, force the American to choose one target and let the others escape, survivable for the majority, fatal for the one selected, because a lone Oscar running from a P-38 in a straight line at low altitude gave the American pilot the simplest possible gunnery solution: no deflection, no convergence calculation, a pure tail chase with the bullet stream concentrated on an exhaust stack and a fuel tank separated from the cockpit by a sheet of aluminum thinner than a fingernail. The dispersal tactic saved 6 pilots by sacrificing 2. Japanese squadron strength at Wewak dropped from an authorized 36 aircraft to an operational average of 11 by April 1944. The arithmetic worked against them at every level: national, operational, tactical, personal. McGuire died on January 7, 1945, over Los Negros Island, at age 24, trying to protect a wingman during a low-altitude turning fight with a Ki-43. He violated every principle that had kept him alive. He turned and slowed and fought the Oscar's fight instead of the Lightning's. The aircraft stalled, spun, and hit the ground. 38 confirmed kills in his logbook. Congressional Medal of Honor, posthumous. His body stayed in the jungle for over a year before a recovery team found the wreckage. The cockpit had compressed on impact to a space smaller than a bathtub. He weighed 132 pounds at his last physical. The geometry that made him lethal required altitude, speed, separation. Take those away, and the P-38 became a twin-engine liability, heavy and unforgiving. McGuire knew that. He turned anyway. The ammunition counters read 0. All 5 of them, 4 50-caliber channels and 1 20mm drum, every needle flat against the left peg, the way a car's fuel gauge sits after a long drive to nowhere good. Frank Spar ran his thumb across each dial, tapped the 20mm counter twice because sometimes the spring stuck in humid air, and confirmed what the empty brass bags already told him. McGuire had fired approximately 500 rounds of 50 caliber and 60 rounds of 20mm Hispano in a span shorter than a cigarette break. The gun barrels, when Spar touched the blast panel above the nose wheel, burned his fingertips through his work gloves. He jerked his hand back and wiped it on his coveralls, leaving a faint scorch mark on the olive-drab fabric that he pointed out to the armorer walking over with a fresh belt draped across both arms like a sleeping python. 5 Japanese aircraft destroyed with one airplane's combat load. The nose gun geometry had done exactly what Lockheed's engineers intended and what Kenny's doctrine demanded, turned a fighter into an assassination platform where every trigger pull concentrated destruction on a single point rather than scattering it across the sky like seed from a hand. The convergence zone sat between 150 and 250 yards. Inside that window, the P-38's armament produced a density of fire that no wing-gun fighter in any air force on Earth could match. Outside that window, the rounds spread and the advantage dissolved. McGuire and Johnson both lived inside that window. The 70-hour Oscar pilots died there. That concentration principle, guns in the nose, firing parallel to the longitudinal axis, converging at a fixed range, did not retire with the P-38. It migrated. The F-86 Sabre carried 6 50 calibers in the nose over Korea. The F-104 Starfighter mounted a 20mm M61 Vulcan rotary cannon in the fuselage centerline. The F-4 Phantom, when it finally received a gun after the missile-only debacle over Vietnam, got that same Vulcan in an internal mount or a centerline pod, nose position, because 60 years of combat data confirmed what Wewak proved in 1944. You aim the airplane aims the guns. Everything else is trigonometry working against you. The Japanese knew. After the war, during the USSBS interrogations, a staff officer from the Army Air Headquarters in Tokyo, not 4th Air Army, the Central Planning Authority, provided an assessment of Allied fighters ranked by the difficulty they presented to Japanese interceptor doctrine. The P-38 ranked first, above the Corsair with its massive radial and 6 wing guns, above the Hellcat that gutted naval aviation over the Philippine Sea. The officer stated that no tactical adaptation developed during the war successfully neutralized the P-38 when flown by an experienced pilot at altitude. The phrase the translator recorded, unable to establish effective counter-tactics, 4 words that cost the Japanese Army Air Force thousands of airframes and the pilots inside them. Unable to establish effective counter-tactics, their word, unable, not difficult or challenging, unable. The irony sits in what happened next. By late 1944, Japanese fighter units in the Philippines had finally begun implementing a defensive doctrine built specifically around avoiding the P-38's strengths, refusing combat above 12,000 feet, operating only in large formations with dedicated high-cover elements, using cloud banks and terrain masking to deny the diving pass. The doctrine arrived in unit mailboxes around the same time the P-38 began leaving the Pacific Theater. Kenny's squadrons transitioned to P-51s and P-47s for the long-range escort missions the final island-hopping campaign required. The Japanese built their wall against a weapon that had already moved on. The Counter-Tactics Manual, when American intelligence officers found a copy at Clark Field after liberation, ran to 47 pages. Detailed diagrams, altitude bands color-coded by threat level, recommended formation geometries for flights of 4, 8, 12, and 16 aircraft. Someone had spent months on it. The document bore a distribution date of November 1944. McGuire died 2 months later, not because the counter-tactics worked, but because he abandoned the geometry that made him untouchable and fought a turning fight at treetop level against the one aircraft the P-38 should never have engaged on equal terms. Johnson survived the war. 38 kills himself, tied with McGuire when the final tallies settled. He flew home across the Pacific on a transport, landed in San Francisco, and filed his last combat report from a desk at Hamilton Field in Marin County, a 6-page document, typed single-spaced, covering his final 3 months of operations. The report recommended that future fighter designs maintain nose-mounted armament as a non-negotiable requirement. It went to 5th Air Force Headquarters. A clerk stamped it, dated it, and dropped it into an archive box alongside 400 other end-of-tour reports from pilots whose hands had stopped shaking weeks ago. Johnson signed the last page, capped his pen, and walked out into the California sun.